Ladies and gentlemen, I'm honored that you are here tonight in view of there being two enormous attractions in this community tonight, pulling people in opposite directions. Mr. Baryshnikov's Cinderella being performed on Miami Beach, and the new Center for Fine Arts opening in downtown Miami. So believe me when I say to you, I'm honored by your presence in the face of such competition as that. In the program this evening, you're going to meet the family of early keyboard instruments, such as were found in homes and palaces in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. These instruments, which you see on the stage, are each replicas of a specific historical instrument. The first, the Italian pentagonal virginal, an instrument of the 16th century, is a replica by a builder in Oxford, England, of one of two surviving pentagonal virginals by Marco Iadra, an Italian builder whose instruments were exported from Italy to England in the time of Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, his daughter. These instruments were called virginals for perhaps two reasons, neither of which we're absolutely certain about, but both of which make a good story. The Latin word virgula means key in the sense of these sticks of wood. So a virginals is a collection of sticks of wood or keys to play a small harp with. Secondly, because Elizabeth I was the Virgin Queen, this instrument became immensely popular with young ladies in England and was therefore called the virginal. So you can take whichever etymological yarn you wish. History does not tell us for sure which is true, if in fact either. These instruments were the typical home instrument of the 16th century in Italy and in England. They have, as you see, a very small keyboard, only 4 octaves worth of notes. And for those of you with very good eyesight, you might note that the last octave seems quite short. In fact, the distance from C to C is only the distance of a sixth in actual space, and that there are other keys stacked up here on top of what look like the normal sharps. Those other keys are the notes E and D, so that the fingering for that last scale uses 2 black keys, as it were, and the sharps are up on top of the others. It causes a certain amount of finger twisting when you realize what you have to do in order to make it play. The works that I'll play for you to demonstrate this instrument and to give you a sample of the sounds for which this instrument is completely suitable come to us from the very beginnings of keyboard music in Italy. The first 3 pieces come from the very earliest printed music for the harpsichord in Italy. These works are anonymous, as are all the works in the publication of 1551, from which these come. They are based on what evidently were popular songs of the day. Earlier publications were for the organ specifically. These are the first works ever published in Italy that were specifically for the harpsichord, that is to say, for an instrument like this. The first one means the strength of Hercules. The second one is a pavane, which is a slow and very stately dance. And the third, the king's saltarello, a very lively and perky dance. In the middle of the 16th century, pieces of music were extraordinarily short by our standards today. Thus, these pieces are over so quickly that I don't expect you to applaud between them. Let me play all 3, and it may hold your attention for a combined time span of just over 2 minutes. But the marvel, of course, is that you're hearing the very origins of keyboard music, the very earliest keyboard writing, specifically for the plucked string instrument from that great nation, Italy, that has given us so much music over so many centuries. The very first composer whose name is known to us as a composer of music specifically for this instrument is Marco Facoli, whose two pieces I'll play for you next. He was a Venetian composer. He perhaps studied with Merullo, but we do not know that for a fact. What we do know is that he was on hand when a group of incredible geniuses created the Baroque style. He was there when the concept of figured bass was invented and had a hand in it. And for his role in it is totally forgotten today and is in virtually none of the history books. Too bad, because Mr. Facoli was a genius. Now, if you compare the style of writing of the pieces you've just heard by an anonymous composer, you will notice that the music has become more sophisticated. The left hand is called to do more than it was called to do before. The right hand has more interesting ornamentation in the first of the two pieces, which is again an arrangement of a popular song of the day. The second one, a very lively dance. It is, as you note, a tedesca. That's the Italian equivalent of the German dance that was later to become the opening movement of every dance suite, the Allemande. This is the earliest German dance, the earliest Allemande ever composed in Italy. After the time of the very greatest Renaissance and early Baroque composers such as the Gabrielis and Frescobaldi, there emerged a composer, Michelangelo Rossi, who brought the spirit of late Renaissance and early Baroque keyboard writing in Italy to an amazing climax in a series of toccatas which have as their precedents the works of Frescobaldi, but which have no precedence in keyboard writing for the extraordinary use they make of chromaticism. This is absolutely bizarre in its use of harmony. It is possible that Mr. Rossi was a pupil of Frescobaldi. Certainly his toccatas are written as Frescobaldi's are written. They are in sections. The sections are not meant to be played in the same speed, but to have their tempi dictated by the spirit within the performer. Frescobaldi published elaborate prefaces to his own toccatas in which he gives detailed instructions that the works are not to be played with a steady beat, but at the caprice of the performer. Each section is meant to start slowly so that your ear will grasp the material, and each section is meant to conclude slowly and to have a break before the next section so that the listener knows exactly where he goes from one section to the next. Further, there are surprises in the presence of chords in this piece, not progressions of chords as you think of in Baroque and later music, but simple happenings of chords for their surprise value. And as a result, this piece, particularly in its concluding measures, emerges as quite the most fantastical use of the entire chromatic range of this tiny keyboard that was made by any composer in Italy during the 17th century. I might add also that it occasionally seems to put the instrument to a test as to whether the keys will actually do everything that's called on. You realize that on an instrument of that sort, the keys themselves are quite short. They're pivoted, not at a nice point that would make them perfectly balanced so that they can move easily. They're pivoted rather close to the front so that you have to use a good deal of force to move the key with positive action. Second, on the end of those keys are little vertical slips of wood with small tongues mounted in them holding a little quill, only about a little bit more than 1/4 of an inch long. It's that tiny quill, which in the 16th century came from the tail feathers of certain birds, and nowadays comes from a plastic factory, that must excite the string and return to its original position in a fraction of a second so that you can, for example, trill, make rapidly repeated notes, etc. In instruments like these, which are historical replicas, the instruments betray the very same faults that the originals had. And that, of course, is why instruments such as this had to be succeeded by other and more elaborately planned mechanical devices so that the playing could become more positive and more secure. I might add that in case you are unfamiliar with Mr. Rossi and his output, he was sufficiently famous to have been patronized by the Barberini family, one of the great families in Italy. They produced his operas. The man himself was known as an organist in Rome, as a violinist, and as a harpsichordist. His operas were given the most lavish staging of their time, with no less than Bernini as the stage designer. So if you keep in mind what you know of Bernini's works, like the elaborate phantasmagorical fountains that he designed in Rome, while you listen to this rather phantasmagoric piece, I think that you'll then have a degree of appreciation for Mr. Rossi and what he did. When we pass from Italy to England and move a century beyond where we were, we discover an instrument of domestic use, the spinet, whose name, although whose shape, is no longer with us. The name is with us, the shape is not. The spinet piano is an instrument that most people have in their homes. It's the typical domestic instrument of our day. Many of you who took your first piano lessons had a spinet piano at home to practice on. The notion of the spinet was that it was a small, relatively inexpensive instrument that you could have at home. And so, here is one here tonight. This one is a replica of an instrument by the famous English builder Baker Harris, made by a resident of Coral Gables here, Mr. Jacques Weinglass, who loaned it to me for this evening's performance. And he's here in the house, and I'd like you to perhaps meet him after the concert. Music of this domestic sort was ever charming, based mostly on popular songs, folk tunes, and so on. Many of the elegant young ladies of good households kept for themselves manuscript copies of the pieces which they learned. In the case of Anne Cromwell, her virginal book, from which I will play you 4 tiny little selections, each of which lasts less than a minute, was the first cousin of the Protector, Oliver Cromwell. So that's a truly well-to-do household. So she had her own virginal book, a collection of the pieces that she knew, that she played, that she used to share with her friends. And that virginal book has been published just this past year. The sound that this small harpsichord makes, and this is a harpsichord, it is not a virginal. There's a structural difference between the two. On the virginal, there are 2 bridges on the soundboard, one on either side of the instrument. And they set up a curious kind of interference pattern in the vibrations on the soundboard that helps result in that curious tone quality that you heard. Now, the spinet is a harpsichord with only 1 bridge on the soundboard, and it functions with a different sonority. Why? Because the virginal, the strings are plucked by jacks coming up through holes in the soundboard right near their center points. And the strings on the spinet are plucked down near their ends so that they have a different kind of sonority. I think you'll enjoy the sound as I play you these 4 pieces from Anne Cromwell's virginal book. Mind you, the second one I think has a particularly charming title. When we think back to the year 1638, we certainly think in terms of days of old, but here they were in their modern times in 1638 thinking back in time for that piece. meant to read you a poem, and I forgot to do so. It's a little 4-line doggerel verse that Anne Cromwell had written in her own hand into this virginal book. 4 modes in music you shall find to be, but 2 you only use, which here you see. Divided from the semibreve to the quaver, which you may with ease may learn if you endeavor. She's saying that the pieces are in the major mode and in the minor mode, and that they have a narrow range of notes, so that anyone might play them if they merely try. The virginal book of Elizabeth Rogers contains a great deal more serious music than the rather charming but amateurish virginal book of Anne Cromwell. Evidently, Elizabeth Rogers was a much more serious player herself. She evidently frequented the circles of the most exalted music makers of her day. And her collection contains is one of the 2 manuscript sources for the important battle piece by William Byrd, one of the greatest composers, one of the 2 greatest composers in England during the time of Elizabeth I and her successor James II. His teacher, Thomas Tallis, and he were granted the exclusive rights by Elizabeth I to print and sell music. So they had a stranglehold on the rights of publication. In any case, The Battle is a unique work in all of Byrd's many works for the harpsichord, in that it's the only work of his that I know in which there is no finesse. It is, in fact, a rather crude work, possibly because of the subject matter that it treats. It is a battle described in sort of a sequence of events, from the summons which calls the soldiers forth, a variety of marches through which they assemble. Finally, there are the trumpets calling them to battle. So then there is a fanfare. You'll see it on your program as Tara Tan Tara. Then you find what is probably the funniest sound in the whole piece, where the battle is joined and the 2 opposing forces meet in mortal combat for the harpsichordist's fingers. Because the 2 parts chase each other around 1 beat apart, and they don't ever quite come together until the battle is over. And then the defeated side, and we don't know which side it is that got defeated, retreats. And the retreat is a very humorously written out piece, with a written out accelerando as they gallop first slowly and then faster and faster until they get away. The serious moment comes just before the end, in which the dead are buried in a very mournful piece in three beats to the bar. Very, very slow and very, very sad. It's rather moving in its way, and hypnotic in the heavy tread of the feet of the soldiers bearing their slain comrades to their graves. And finally, a little piece of celebration at the end by the victorious side. The instrument on which I will play this is the thing that looks like a child's coffin. This is the Flemish virginal, the other most popular kind of virginal in Europe during the 17th, late 16th and early 17th centuries. This one is a replica of an instrument of 1611 and is caparisoned in the most elegant of formats. The Flemish virginals were notable for their sober exteriors and their exuberant interiors, all of which was caught up in Protestant symbolism of the time, which eschewed outward displays of any sort. Now, the instrument has, as you'll be able to see, precisely the same 4-octave range that the Italian virginal had, and the same stacked up, curious short octave worth of keys in the leftmost position. But the sound is different. The sound of this one, which I'll just touch again, for you, sonority of this one, which is more sophisticated, with a more sophisticated action, better balanced keys, longer jacks with longer plectra that are more flexible and can flick the strings without tearing them, without making such a harsh plucking noise as you heard on the Italian instrument. Now, the last thing I'll say about this piece is, I hope you like C major, because prior to the final movement of the Fifth Symphony of Beethoven, this is the biggest celebration of the sound of C major in the history of music. that is a lot of C major, isn't it? The greatest composer of the late Renaissance and early Baroque in England was Henry Purcell. So great was he that he was called Britain's Orpheus. We think of him primarily, of course, as the composer of wonderful instrumental and operatic works. His harpsichord music is relatively slender. There are 8 suites, which constitute one slender volume, and a collection of miscellaneous pieces, culled mostly from instrumental works and operas of his. We owe the publication of the 8 suites of Henry Purcell to his widow, who, in need of money the year after his death, found the manuscript and had it published. Otherwise, they might have been lost to us altogether. In these pieces, we find a great deal of French influence. The reason being that Purcell had been a pupil of a man named Pelham Humphreys. You ever hear of him? Pelham Humphreys. Pelham Humphreys was a curious character. If I can find I have a quote here about him that you must share with me. He was the favored musician of King Charles II of England, who himself was a great admirer of all things French. And so he wanted young Pelham to absorb French culture, French music in particular, and he paid his way for a year abroad to go and absorb French culture. When he came back, Samuel Pepys, who knew Pelham Humphreys, recorded in his diary that Humphreys returned an absolute monsieur, full of form and confidence and vanity. He disparages everything and everybody's skill but his own, and thinks that he and the king are mighty great. Well, in this music by Purcell, you find 2 remarkable French traits. The first, in the brief prelude that precedes this tiny suite, you find the style of writing of the French clavecinists, whose work is the substance of our second half tonight on the large harpsichord. Their art of preluding, which was based on free treatment of the keyboard, spelling out one harmony after another to allow the player's fingers the chance to acquire familiarity with the instrument, and the audience a chance to allow the tonality of the piece to settle into its ears. Then follows an elaborate allemande. Remember the Tedesco we heard, the very first allemande written in Italy? Well, here is a full-blown French allemande written by the pupil of Pelham Humphreys, Henry Purcell. And in this, we find what the French call the style brisé, the broken style of the lutanists of the day applied to the harpsichord, full of rubatos which have been precisely notated in the music. Quite a remarkable feat of notation, indicating the tremendous advances made by people in the science of notation for music. There is no courant to go with it. Evidently, the sheet that must have contained it got lost by Mrs. Purcell when she was gathering these things together, because there must have been one. And finally, in place of the French gigue, which normally would have concluded an early suite like this, we have a very typically English dance. Now, they didn't have very many French harpsichords in England, so this would have probably been played in Purcell's time by most people on the spinet, so I thought I'd play it on the spinet for you. last piece before our 10-minute intermission is a piece that used to be known as Purcell's Trumpet Voluntary. We found out it wasn't by Purcell at all. It was by Jeremiah Clark, a contemporary of Purcell, and a man whose life ended quite dramatically. He shot himself to death in a fit of melancholia at the ripe old age of 38. This is the Prince of Denmark's March. I'm not going to play the piece called Rondo, which is the English version of calling something a rondo, because I left the music at home. I couldn't find it when I got ready to come. So I'll just play one piece then, and that is the Prince's March. But it's a charming piece. You'll recognize the tune at once. What's fascinating about it is that despite its long-time identity as the trumpet voluntary, it isn't voluntary at all. It isn't a trumpet. Anything has nothing to do with the trumpet at all. It is the Prince of Denmark's March. In the same key as the Personal Suite. That's why I put them side by side. The harpsichord itself, as an instrument with a keyboard at one end and the strings running laterally, horizontally away from the player, had a long evolution. You've seen some of its forebears this evening, and you will see a still earlier forebear in the next concert, and an even later successor if you darken our doorway on the 25th. And hear the final chapter in this saga of how the harpsichord and its keyboard and its literature developed. Well, the instrument that you see before you now is an example of the late 18th century French harpsichord. It's a sophisticated instrument, one whose two keyboards and three sets of strings enable the player to control a palette of sound through his fingers. One sound at a time. You need two sounds or all three at once. And the variety of textures that a player can produce with his fingertips. The original of this instrument is in Edinburgh. It was built in 1769 by Pascal Tasquin, the most famous Parisian harpsichord builder, the man who built the harpsichord for Rameau. And it is that instrument that has survived today in the Edinburgh collection, which was copied to produce this. The decoration on the instrument reproduces the decoration inside the lid on another Tasquin that's in the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. The French were very fond of imitation Chinese landscapes. They called that style, which they developed, chinoiserie. And there is an example of it. It doesn't light up terribly well here because we don't have theatrical lighting with spots right in my eyes to destroy me but make the instrument look pretty. The music of the French clavecinists suited to an instrument of this sort is voluminous. It would occupy a shelf about 3 feet wide. There are thousands of pieces by French composers. The man who founded the school of French harpsichord composition is the man whose chaconne in F major I now will play for you. Chambonnières was the man who set the pattern to be taken up by all of his successors. His is the most idiomatic writing for this kind of keyboard imaginable. It does not suit the German-style harpsichords, the Flemish harpsichords, the Italian harpsichords, or the English harpsichords. It is inimical to this kind of harpsichord. It's delicately quilled. The sound it makes for a thing as large as it is light, clear as air itself. The upper manual has a sonority slightly nasal, reminiscent of the sound of woodwinds. The lower manual, main sound, is richer, darker, more suggestive of the sound of gambas, violins, and cellos. The two together make a rich ensemble, and for particularly exuberant sounds, there is another set of strings pitched an octave above those two, very lightly quilled, but which adds brilliance to the whole ensemble. And you'll hear all of these combinations in the works that I'm going to play for you, which span from Chambonnières clear through to the most decadent phases of writing in the 18th century in France for this kind of instrument. The reason for featuring the instrument tonight in an entire half of this program is that tonight's program and the program on the 25th are benefits designed to help us acquire a harpsichord of this type. It's the basic standard instrument which we use for teaching and performance today. These others are lovely additions to one's household of instruments, but they cannot be used for the entirety of the literature, nor can they be used to teach all the subtleties of proper performance of the harpsichord. So I pay particular tribute tonight to those persons whose names are on the front of this program, who have already, before the program even took place, contributed more than $2,500 to this project. But also to persons who have sent contributions in since this went to press. Mr. and Mrs. Louis Hector, Mr. and Mrs. Lee Hills, Mr. and Mrs. Jack Weisglass, Mr. and Mrs. Jacques Ross, and Mr. and Mrs. Simeon Spear. And of course, I've already paid tribute to all of you who are here this evening to help this cause. Let me now treat you to the sounds of the development of harpsichord writing in France across 2 centuries, from Chambonnières to Forqueray. The chaconne of Chambonnières is only 2 pages long. It's a grand piece in its quiet, calm, slow-paced fashion. It's as grand as anything Lully ever wrote for the opera. It's as grand as anything Racine ever wrote for the stage, but in miniature. great Passacaglia in B minor of François Couperin Le Grand is unique in Couperin's oeuvre. It is the longest harpsichord piece he wrote and is believed by everyone to be the very greatest harpsichord piece he wrote. Its form is identical to the form of the chaconne you just heard. There is an 8-bar refrain that comes back after each couplet. There are 9 couplets in a row, and after each, the 8-bar refrain, building in its steady pace and remarkable chromatic harmony, the most tremendous culminative effect in the space of about 7 or 8 minutes. This is regarded as the apex of French harpsichord writing, the very grandest piece ever written in that 2-century span, after which come then the more brilliant works of Rameau and the works of the other persons to whom I will introduce you in moments. This piece, if you thought you observed a number of ornaments in the previous work, you will observe even more ornamentation in this. It is almost the summation of the French style of elaborate ornamentation designed to make the music as rich as the decoration of the clothing of aristocrats at that time, or the decoration of their palaces, or the fanciful and elaborate paintings of Fragonard and Boucher, the elaborate versification of some of the French writers. You have here as it were, all that the French knew about the harpsichord rolled into one piece. pieces by Rameau, unlike Couperin's music, are interested in the effects of rhythm, in depicting quirky personalities, and above all, in captivating the listener through a certain degree of hijinks at the keyboard. Les Sauvages describes American Indians, his idea of them dancing around. It's quite a curious little piece. Les Tendres Plaintes is a piece very sad in its way, but not the kind of gushy emotions of the Romantic era. Oh, no, these emotions are held in check. They are gentle tears. The tender complaints are being murmured here, all in the context of the most discreet upbringing on the part of the participants. And finally, La Triomphante, exuberant celebration of the keyboard. I don't know what who triumphed over what, but the piece itself emerges as a quite jolly walk around the keyboard. I'll play these three together.